So hey anime fans. The new series had arrived and series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Teen Titian. So let's start the series. The Great Gate of Konohagakure loomed, a carved visage of a mountain that was less a defensive structure and more a declaration. It spoke of centuries, of roots sunk deep into the earth. For the three squads approaching along the main road, it was a monolith of a different kind, a symbol of the village that had, for years, existed only in mission briefings and whispered rumors. Garfield Namikaze walked at the head of the procession, the afternoon sun catching the glint of his Konoha Hitai 8, the metal plate tied with a blue cloth around his neck. It felt foreign against his skin. He'd worn a different village's insignia for so long, the weight of this one was a constant, unfamiliar pressure. Beside him, Richard Grayson moved with an effortless, ground-eating grace, his eyes scanning the tree line, the road, the sky, cataloging every detail with the ingrained habit of a career shinobi. Looks just like the paintings in the old archives, Richard murmured, his voice low, meant only for Garfield. Older. More, lived in. Garfield didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the gate, on the two Chunin guards who were straightening up, their postures shifting from relaxed vigilance to professional alertness. One of them, a stocky man with a scar across his nose, stepped forward, hand raised in a standard greeting. Halt. State your village and purpose, the Chunin called out, his eyes sweeping over the group behind them. Behind Garfield and Richard, the 9 genin had come to a stop. Garfield could feel them, a palpable presence at his back. He didn't need to turn to know the exact placement of each one. Connor, broad-shouldered and silent, stood like a carved pillar of granite. Starfire floated a bare inch off the ground, her green eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Terra shifted her weight from foot to foot, the very earth beneath her seeming to hum in sympathy with her restlessness. Roy Harper's gaze was already picking out sightlines and vantage points on the outer wall, a habit he shared with Richard. Stephanie Wayne stood with a calm poise that belied the sophisticated gadgets Garfield knew were hidden in the folds of her standard-issue flak jacket. Blackfire's posture was one of bored contempt, her arms crossed, while Cameron, the pale, quiet boy with ice-blue eyes, simply observed, as still and cold as a winter morning. And Raven. Raven hovered at the edge of the group, her presence a cool, still pool in the midst of the team's restless energy. Her hood was up, shadowing her face, but Garfield knew her amethyst eyes were fixed on the village, reading the emotional currents that bled from its walls like mist off a river. Garfield finally met the Chunin's gaze. Garfield Namikaze, Jonin of the village hidden in the shadows. These are my squads, here to participate in the Chunin selection exams. His voice was even, carrying the flat, authoritative tone of a man used to being obeyed. He produced the official scroll from his pouch and handed it over. The Chunin's eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the name. Namikaze. He unrolled the scroll, scanned the official seals, the Hokage's own signature stamp, verified by complex chakra signatures, and then his gaze flickered past Garfield to the genin behind him. His professional mask slipped for a second, revealing a flicker of something. Wariness? Assessment? He saw it. They all saw it. The sheer, coiled potential of the 9 young shinobi was not something that could be hidden by travel dust and tired eyes. Right this way, Jonin Namikaze, the guard said, his tone more formal now. The Hokage has been notified of your arrival. You're to be escorted to the administrative building for registration and a preliminary briefing. They passed under the great gate, and the weight of the village settled around them. It was a sensory overload after the quiet of the road. The scent of dango from a street vendor warred with the smell of hot asphalt and engine oil from a passing plumbing supply truck. The cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, children laughing, and the ever-present hum of a city of thousands filled the air. Civilians in bright clothing jostled past shinobi in their standard blues and greens. Garfield's eyes moved, taking it all in, comparing it to the mental map he'd studied. The Hokage Tower, perched on the mountainside like a watchful lord. The academy buildings. The sprawling residential districts. It was all as the scrolls described. Yet, it felt alien. He had been born in a small house in this village, had taken his first steps on these very streets. But the memories were phantom limbs, achingly present but attached to nothing real. His life was the shadow village now. His loyalties were to the people who walked beside him. So many people, Starfire breathed, her voice a melody of wonder. She drifted closer to the group, her bright orange hair a beacon in the sea of browns and blacks. They all seem so busy. Is there a festival? It's called daily life, Star, Blackfire said, her voice a whipcrack of condescension. Try to contain your awe. You're representing a village, not on a sightseeing tour. Starfire's expression didn't falter. She simply smiled at her sister, a smile so genuinely warm it seemed to slide off Blackfire's armor of scorn. But it is wonderful to see so many people living and laughing, sister. Is that not a good thing? Richard shot Blackfire a look, a brief, sharp glance that was a command for silence. It was a dynamic Garfield had seen 1,000 times. Richard was the field commander, the strategist, the one who could read a room and a person with equal skill. He kept Blackfire's more aggressive tendencies in check with an authority born of quiet competence, not brute force. They were a strange collection, Garfield knew. An adopted family forged in the crucible of a village built on the principles of second chances and fierce loyalty. The village hidden in the shadows wasn't one of the 5 great nations, but its military strength was whispered about in the same breath as IWA or Kumo. They were the outsiders, the wild cards, and they were here to make a statement. As they walked, Garfield felt a familiar prickle at the edge of his senses. They were being watched. Not just by the curious eyes of civilians, but by shinobi. ANBU, most likely, flitting through the rooftops and shadows, tracking their progress. A team of Chunin on a balcony above pretended to play cards, but their eyes were sharp, missing nothing. It was standard procedure for a foreign contingent, especially one with their reputation. He expected it. He welcomed it, even. Let them watch. Let them assess. The real measure of their strength wouldn't be found in a simple walk through the market district. It was then that he saw the boy. A flash of sun-yellow hair in the crowd, a splash of orange against the muted tones of the street. The boy was laughing, a loud, boisterous sound, his arms waving as he argued with a pink-haired girl his age. A dark-haired boy walked a few paces ahead, radiating a sullen, superior aura that parted the crowd around him like a ship's prow. Garfield's breath caught in his throat. His steps faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Richard, attuned to him, shot him a questioning glance, but Garfield's eyes were locked on that bright head of hair. It was impossible. A trick of the light. A ghost. The boy turned, his profile visible for a moment. The whisker-like marks on his cheeks were stark against his skin. He was yelling something about ramen, his expression a chaotic mix of frustration and humor. Then the crowd shifted, and he was gone, swallowed by the flow of people. Garfield stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. The name echoed in his mind, a whisper from a past life. Minato. His brother's face, young and brilliant, superimposed over that of the boy. The same shocking hair, the same vibrant blue of his eyes, a blue Garfield had seen only in his oldest, most carefully preserved memories. Garfield? Richard's voice was quiet, urgent. You okay? Garfield blinked, forcing air into his lungs. He turned his head, meeting Richard's concerned gaze. He saw the same boy, the same flash of yellow, reflected in the window of a weapons shop. He was running now, chased by the pink-haired girl, the dark-haired boy trailing after them with an expression of supreme annoyance. I thought I saw someone I knew, Garfield managed, his voice rough. He started walking again, his legs feeling wooden. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The seed of a terrible, wonderful, impossible doubt had been planted. He knew the reports. He knew what the third Hokage had told him, all those years ago, his face a mask of kindly sorrow. The Kyuubi attack. Minato and Kushina, giving their lives to seal the beast. Their son, Naruto, had not survived the night. A tragic, collateral casualty of war. The infant had been too weak, the trauma too great. It was a closed chapter, a painful truth Garfield had long ago accepted and buried under the life he had built. Yet that boy's face was a mirror held up to the past. They reached the administrative building, a sturdy, functional structure near the Hokage Tower. The escorting Chunin handed them over to a stern-faced woman at the reception desk, who led them to a large conference room. The room was sparse, a long table, chairs, a portrait of the third Hokage on the wall. Through the large windows, they could see the village sprawling below. As the genin filed in, their quiet chatter and subtle posturing filling the room, Raven drifted to stand beside Garfield. Her presence was a cool comfort, a familiar stillness. He felt her gaze on him, even though he couldn't see her eyes beneath her hood. Your emotions are a storm, she said, her voice a low whisper, meant only for him. Anger. Grief. Confusion. What happened out there? Garfield didn't look at her. He stared out the window, watching the distant, ant-like figures moving through the streets. He couldn't find the boy. Of course he couldn't. A ghost, Raven. I think I saw a ghost. She was silent for a moment, and he knew she was reaching out with her empathy, not to pry, but to understand. There are no ghosts in the street. Only the living. Who did you see? He finally turned to her, his green eyes, so like his brother's, clouded with a turmoil he couldn't name. My nephew. The one I was told died the night my brother did. The air around Raven seemed to still further. He saw her pale chin lift slightly, a sign she was processing. Then the information you were given. was either a lie or a mistake of colossal proportions. He ran a hand through his spiky blonde hair, a gesture of pure frustration. I need to be sure. I can't just. I need to know. The door to the conference room opened, cutting off their conversation. A tall man with silver hair that defied gravity, a mask covering the lower half of his face, and a single, sandal-clad foot resting on the opposite knee as he leaned against the doorframe. One eye, the color of blood, was curved in what might have been a smile. He held a small orange book in his hand, his thumb marking his place. Ah, the delegation from the village hidden in the shadows, the man said, his voice lazy, amused. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room with a loose-limbed grace. I'm Kakashi Hatake. I've been assigned as your liaison for the duration of your stay. The Hokage sends his greetings and hopes your journey was pleasant. Kakashi's visible eye swept over them. It lingered for a moment on Garfield, noting the Namake's features with a flicker of something, surprise? Recognition, before moving on to Richard, then to each of the genin in turn. Garfield saw the lazy demeanor for what it was, a carefully constructed facade. The man's attention was razor-sharp, missing nothing. He assessed Connor's physique, noted the way Roy's hands rested near his weapon pouches, caught the subtle glow of Tamaranian energy around Starfire's hands. He was, Garfield realized, a shinobi of terrifying caliber. The pleasure is ours, Hatake-san, Richard said, stepping forward smoothly, taking over the social dance. We appreciate the welcome. We're eager to get started. I'll bet you are, Kakashi said, his eye curving again. He flipped a page in his book, seemingly engrossed. The exams start tomorrow. Registration is done. You'll be given your team assignments and your exam numbers in the morning. For now, you'll be taken to your lodgings. Get some rest. You'll need it. His gaze landed on Garfield one last time. Namake's, huh? That's a name with some weight in this village. There was a layer of meaning beneath the simple words, a question left unasked. Garfield met his look evenly. So I've been told. Kakashi nodded, a slight dip of his head, and then his attention was back on his book. Follow me. The lodgings were a traditional inn, a sprawling, two-story wooden structure with a serene garden in the central courtyard. It was a welcome change from the stark functionality of the administrative building. The genin were assigned rooms, the inevitable squabbles over space and proximity breaking out immediately. Blackfire demanded a room facing east. Terra wanted to be on the ground floor, closer to the earth. Roy and Connor simply claimed the largest room and dared anyone to challenge them. Stephanie mediated with the practiced ease of someone used to managing egos. Starfire was delighted with everything. Cameron silently took the smallest, darkest room at the end of the hall. Garfield and Richard were given a shared room overlooking the garden. As the sounds of the genin settling in faded, Garfield stood at the window, the image of the blonde boy burning in his mind. He saw Raven glide across the courtyard below, a shadow among shadows, and head towards a quiet corner of the garden, seeking solitude. You're going to go looking for him, aren't you? Richard said, not looking up from where he was meticulously cleaning and oiling a set of thin, razor-sharp kunai. I have to, Garfield replied. If there's even a chance. I know. Richard slid a kunai back into its holster. Just be careful. We're guests here. And that Hokage of yours, he's been in power for a long time. He didn't get there by being careless with his secrets. Garfield nodded, a tight, jerky motion. He pulled on a plain dark jacket over his Jonin vest, concealing his Hitai-8. He slipped out of the inn not through the door, but through the window, scaling the wall to the roof with the silent ease of a lifetime of practice. He moved through the twilight, a wraith over the rooftops of Konoha. Finding the boy wasn't difficult. He just followed the whispers. The name on people's lips, spoken with a mixture of disdain, pity, and fear. Uzumaki. Naruto Uzumaki. The demon brat. The words were like shards of glass in Garfield's chest. He tracked him to an apartment building, a modest, worn-down structure on the edge of the residential district. A single light was on in a top-floor window. Garfield landed silently on the rooftop across the street, settling into the shadows. He waited. An hour passed. Then another. He saw the boy through the window, a small, lonely figure eating cup ramen at a tiny table, talking to a half-dead plant on his windowsill as if it were a person. He saw him later, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, a profound and aching loneliness radiating from his small frame even from this distance. It was him. Garfield knew it with a certainty that bypassed logic and burrowed straight into his soul. It wasn't just the hair, or the eyes. It was the way he moved, a hint of Minato's restless energy. It was the stubborn set of his jaw, so like Kushina's. This child was his brother's son. He was alive. He was alone. And the village that should have cherished him as a hero's legacy treated him like a pariah. Rage, cold and clear as mountain water, flooded Garfield's veins. It was directed not at the ignorant villagers, but at the man in the Hokage tower. At Hiruzen Sarutobi, the professor, the man who had held Garfield as a child and told him, with tears in his eyes, that his family was gone. He had lied. He had let this child grow up like this. Why? What possible reason could justify such a betrayal? He watched until the light in the boy's, Naruto's, window went out. He stayed until the first faint light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Then, heavy with a truth he could barely comprehend, he melted back into the shadows and returned to the inn. Raven was waiting for him in the garden, sitting on a smooth stone by the koi pond. She didn't look up as he landed softly beside her. "It's him," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "Minato's son. My nephew. He's alive." Raven finally lifted her head. In the pale dawn light, her amethyst eyes were pools of ancient sorrow and profound understanding. "I know," she said softly. "I felt him. A bright, lonely fire. So much pain, but so much spirit. He carries a great darkness within him, Garfield. A terrible, churning evil. But it is sealed. It is not him." "The Kyuubi," Garfield breathed, the pieces clicking into place with sickening finality. "They made him the container. They sealed it inside a baby." Raven nodded slowly. "The truth is a heavy thing. And the one who buried it sits in the highest seat in the village." They stood together in the growing light, the weight of their discovery settling around them. The mission, the Chunin exams, the evaluation of their genin, the political dance, had just become infinitely more complex. For Garfield Namikaze, the past he had buried had just clawed its way back to the surface, wearing the face of a lonely, yellow-haired boy. And he knew, with a shinobi's grim certainty, that this secret would not stay buried for long. The storm Raven had sensed in him was only just beginning. Next. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Exam Hall. The dawn came too quickly, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and pale gold. Garfield had not slept. He sat in the window of the shared room, one knee drawn up, watching the village stir to life below. Somewhere out there, Naruto was waking up alone in that tiny apartment, preparing for the same exams that had brought Garfield here. The thought was a barbed wire wrapped around his chest. Richard found him there when he rose, saying nothing at first. He simply began his morning routine, stretches, breathing exercises, a careful inspection of his gear. It was their way. Richard knew when to speak and when to let silence do its work. "We need to focus today," Richard finally said, his voice gentle but firm. He was tying his Hitai-8 into place, the metal catching the light. "Whatever you've discovered, whatever you're feeling, it can't interfere with the mission. Our genin need us sharp." Garfield nodded, though the motion felt mechanical. "I know. I won't let it." But even as he said it, he felt the weight of the lie. How could he not let it interfere? His brother's son was alive, growing up despised in the village that should have honored him as a hero's legacy. The third Hokage had looked Garfield in the eye 15 years ago and spoken words of comfort that were now revealed as carefully constructed falsehoods. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to confront Sarutobi, to demand answers, to find Naruto and somehow make amends for nearly 2 decades of absence. Instead, he would spend the day watching genin compete for promotion, playing the role of the visiting jonin from a minor village. Richard clapped him on the shoulder, a brief, grounding pressure. "We'll figure this out. But first, we have a job to do." The examination hall was a massive, multi-story structure near the academy, its walls lined with windows that let in the pale morning light. Genin teams from across the nations were already gathering outside, a chaotic sea of Hitai-8 and flak jackets, nervous energy and bravado. Garfield spotted headbands from Suna, Kusa, Oto, and half a dozen smaller villages he couldn't immediately identify. The leaf genin were everywhere, identifiable by their blue clothing and the leaf insignia on their forehead protectors. Richard moved through the crowd like a fish through water, his presence somehow parting the masses without any apparent effort. Garfield followed, his eyes scanning automatically for threats, for anomalies, for... He stopped. There, near the entrance, stood Team 7. Sakura Haruno was adjusting her headband, her pink hair a bright splash of color. Sasuke Uchiha leaned against the wall with practiced indifference, already attracting the wide-eyed stares of half the kunoichi in the vicinity. And Naruto was bouncing on his heels, practically vibrating with excitement, his blue eyes scanning the crowd with open curiosity. The same eyes that had looked at Garfield from his brother's face 1,000 times in memory. "Garfield." Richard's voice was quiet, urgent. "Eyes forward. You're staring." Garfield wrenched his gaze away, but not before Naruto's attention swept past him, lingered for a confused moment, then moved on. The boy hadn't recognized him. Why would he? Garfield had left this village before Naruto was born, a young Chunin with stars in his eyes and an older brother who was already a legend. To Naruto, he was just another foreign jonin. But Garfield saw it now, in the bright light of morning. The resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of his face, the way his smile crinkled the corners of his eyes, it was Minato, brought back to life in a 14-year-old body. The whisker marks were the only difference, marks that Garfield now understood were the physical evidence of the beast sealed within him. The Hatake is watching us, Raven murmured, appearing at Garfield's side as if materialized from the crowd itself. Her hood was up, her face shadowed, but he felt her attention shift toward the building's roof. Kakashi sat on the edge of the roof, one leg dangling, his orange book in hand. But his visible eye was fixed on them, on Garfield specifically. He raised his free hand in a lazy wave. Garfield returned the gesture with a short nod, forcing his expression into professional neutrality. Whatever Kakashi knew or suspected, now was not the time to reveal anything. The doors to the examination hall slid open, and a stern-faced Chunin with a shaved head barked for all genin to enter. The crowd began to funnel inside, a river of young shinobi flowing toward their first test. Garfield and Richard took up positions near the back of the hall, where they could observe without interfering. Raven drifted to Garfield's side, a shadow among shadows. The hall itself was cavernous, filled with rows of desks where genin were instructed to sit. At the front, a narrow staircase led to a second-floor observation area where jonin and other officials could watch the proceedings. Garfield noted the ANBU positioned in the rafters, the subtle seals embedded in the walls designed to contain chakra use, the cameras in the corners, likely feeding live feeds to the Hokage Tower. Everything about this exam was designed to assess, to categorize, to rank. A man appeared at the front of the hall, and the room fell silent. He was thin to the point of emaciation, his face wrapped in bandages that left only his eyes visible. Those eyes were cold, reptilian, sweeping across the assembled genin with barely concealed contempt. "I am Ibiki Marino," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "Your proctor for the first exam." He gestured to the papers on each desk. "You will find a test before you. Answer the questions. Cheat and you will be caught. Be caught and your entire team is disqualified. Any questions?" Naruto's hand shot up. "Yeah. These are all really hard. What kind of test is this?" Ibiki's eyes fixed on him, and something like a smile tugged at the bandages around his mouth. "The kind that separates those who are ready to be Chunin from those who are not. Sit down and begin." From the observation area, Garfield watched as the genin bent over their papers. His eyes kept drifting back to Naruto, who was staring at his test with an expression of pure horror. The boy clearly wasn't a scholar. But even as Garfield watched, Naruto's expression shifted, from panic to determination to something else entirely. He began writing. "Clever," Richard murmured, leaning against the railing beside Garfield. "The test isn't about the answers. It's about information gathering under pressure. Look at them." Garfield looked. Really looked. And he saw it, the subtle signs of cheating everywhere. Genin using hidden mirrors, writing on their nails, forming hand signs for sensory techniques under their desks. A boy from Suna had a small lizard hidden in his sleeve, its eyes darting to nearby papers. A kunoichi from Kusa was using her long hair to conceal slight head movements as she read her neighbor's answers. And then there was his own contingent. The Shadow Village genin had been seated in different sections of the room, scattered to prevent collaboration. But scattered didn't mean helpless. Connor sat at his desk, his paper completely blank, his expression bored. He wasn't even looking at anyone else's test. He was simply waiting. Beside him, a genin from Odo sneered. "What's wrong, big guy? Can't figure out the answers?" Connor glanced at him, and the Odo genin flinched. It wasn't a threatening look, just a direct one. "I'm waiting for someone to make a mistake," Connor said, his voice low and even. "Then I'll have all the answers I need." Further back, Roy Harper had positioned himself strategically. From his angle, he could see the papers of at least 6 other genin, and Garfield watched as his hands moved almost imperceptibly, adjusting a small device on his wrist. A camera, Garfield realized. He was photographing answers and feeding them to a tiny receiver hidden in his ear. His own paper remained blank, but his hand moved in a perfect simulation of writing. Stephanie Wayne had taken a different approach. She was actually answering the questions from her own knowledge, her face calm and focused. But Garfield noticed the way her eyes flickered to the proctors, the way her fingers tapped out a rhythm on her desk that was anything but random. Code, he realized. She was communicating with someone. Cameron sat completely still, his paper untouched. Ice crystals were forming on the edges of his desk, subtle enough to escape notice unless one was looking directly at him. Through those crystals, Garfield realized, Cameron could feel the vibrations of the room, including the movement of pencils on paper. He was reading the answers through the floor. Blackfire was cheating with the subtlety of a battering ram. Her purple eyes glowed faintly as she scanned the room, reading papers from across the hall with her Tamaranian-enhanced vision. When a proctor glanced her way, the glow vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of bored innocence that fooled no one who knew her. Tara had her hands flat on her desk, her eyes closed. Through the stone of the building, she could feel the movements of every person in the room, could sense which way they were leaning, which papers they were turning. She was building a three-dimensional map of the entire exam hall in her mind. And Starfire was beaming. She had finished her paper in the first 15 minutes and was now looking around the room with open fascination, waving at anyone who caught her eye. The proctors didn't know what to make of her. Neither, apparently, did the other genin. A boy from Kumo stared at her with his mouth open. Starfire waved brighter. But it was Raven who drew Garfield's attention most. She sat perfectly still, her paper untouched, her eyes closed beneath her hood. Her lips moved slightly, forming words no one could hear, and Garfield felt a faint brush of her power, not toward the genin, but toward the proctors. She was reading their emotions, gauging which ones were about to make a move, which ones had already detected cheating. She was creating a real-time threat assessment and, Garfield suspected, feeding it to the others through whatever method Stephanie was using to communicate. "Your kids are impressive," a voice said from behind them. Garfield turned to find Kakashi leaning against the wall, his book tucked away for once. His visible eye was fixed on the genin below, and there was something like genuine interest in his expression. "They're not kids," Richard said smoothly. "They're shinobi." Kakashi's eye curved in what might have been a smile. "Fair enough. Still, they're handling the pressure well. Most foreign teams crack under Ibiki's stare within the first hour." He paused, his gaze lingering on Raven. "That one, though. She's something else. I can't quite read her chakra. It's like trying to read a shadow." Raven's head tilted slightly, as if she'd heard him, though Garfield knew she couldn't possibly from this distance. Or could she? "She's our sensor type," Garfield said, keeping his voice neutral. "All villages have them." "True." Kakashi pushed off the wall and moved to stand beside Garfield at the railing. His presence was oddly comfortable, despite everything Garfield knew, or suspected, about him. "You know, I trained under your brother. For a while, at least." The words hit Garfield like a physical blow. He kept his expression still, but he felt Raven's attention sharpen, felt her emotional awareness reaching toward him like a cool hand on a fevered brow. "I didn't know that," Garfield managed. "Not many people do." It was brief. He was Hokage, didn't have much time for one-on-one instruction. Kakashi's voice was light, but there was weight beneath it. He was extraordinary. The fastest shinobi alive. A mind for strategy that left everyone else in the dust. And genuinely kind. That was the rarest part. In our world, genuine kindness is usually the first thing to get burned away. Garfield said nothing. Below, he saw Naruto suddenly stiffen, his eyes widening. The 10th question, Garfield realized. Ibiki had just announced it, the question that could cost them everything. Stay and answer incorrectly, and they'd be genin forever. Leave now, and they'd fail but could try again next year. Naruto's hand shot up. "I'm not leaving. I'm gonna be Hokage someday, and Hokage don't quit. I'll take your stupid question and I'll answer it and I'll prove I'm better than all of you." The room went silent. Ibiki stared at Naruto for a long moment, and then, impossibly, his scarred face broke into something that might have been a smile. "Interesting," Kakashi murmured. "He's got your brother's stubborn streak." And Kushina's mouth. Garfield's heart stopped. He turned to look at Kakashi, but the other Jonin was already walking away, his hands in his pockets, his visible eye hidden behind the fall of his silver hair. "What just happened?" Richard asked quietly. Garfield couldn't answer. His mind was racing. Kakashi knew. He had to know. The comment about Naruto wasn't casual observation, it was deliberate. A message. But from whom? And why? Below, the exam continued. Naruto's declaration had apparently been the right answer, because Ibiki announced that everyone who remained had passed. The tension in the room shattered like glass, replaced by relieved laughter and exhausted tears. The Shadow Village genin rose from their desks, their expressions ranging from Connor's bored satisfaction to Starfire's delighted clapping. But Garfield barely saw them. He was watching Naruto, who was now surrounded by his teammates, Sakura looking at him with something like respect for the first time, Sasuke with his usual cool indifference but a faint flicker of something warmer in his dark eyes. And Kakashi, appearing beside them as if from nowhere, his hand coming down on Naruto's head in a gesture that was almost fond. He knows, Garfield thought. He's known all along. He's been watching over him. The question was, why hadn't anyone told Garfield? Why had the third Hokage's lie been allowed to stand for 15 years? The second exam was announced with the subtlety of a bomb blast. Enko Mitarashi, the proctor, was everything Ibiki was not, loud, abrasive, and possessed of an appetite for chaos that bordered on the theatrical. She stood before the assembled genin at the gates of Forest of Death, a massive, walled expanse of trees that radiated danger even from the outside. "Listen up, you little runts," Enko shouted, biting into a dango skewer with obvious enjoyment. "The second exam is simple. You'll enter the forest through these gates. You'll survive for 5 days. You'll reach the tower in the center with your team and both scrolls, heaven and earth. Fail any of those, and you're out. Any questions?" Naruto's hand shot up. "What's in the forest?" Enko's grin widened, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Everything. Giant animals. Poisonous plants. Other teams who'd kill you for your scrolls. And maybe, just maybe, something worse." She bit another dango. "Any other questions?" There were none. The teams began to enter at intervals, assigned gates and starting times to prevent immediate massacres at the entrance. Garfield watched from an observation platform as Team 7 approached their gate, Naruto bouncing with excitement, Sakura trying to look brave, Sasuke radiating his usual cool confidence. "The Uchiha boy carries a heavy burden," Raven said softly. She had appeared beside him again, a habit Garfield was beginning to appreciate. Hatred. Loss. The need for revenge. It's eating him alive from the inside. "And Naruto?" Raven was silent for a moment. "Loneliness. Deeper than anything I've felt in years. But also something else. Determination. The need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter to someone. It burns so brightly it almost hurts to touch." Garfield watched as Naruto disappeared through the gate, his bright orange jacket the last thing to vanish into the gloom of the forest. He shouldn't have had to feel that. He should have been raised as a hero, as Minato's son. Instead, they made him a pariah and called it protection. "We don't know the full story yet," Richard said, joining them. "We need more information before we act." "I know." Garfield's voice was tight. "But I'm done waiting." The observation platform began to fill with other jonin and officials, all there to monitor the exam's progress through the various sensors and cameras placed throughout the forest. Garfield took up a position near the back, where he could watch without being drawn into conversation. Hours passed. The screens showed glimpses of teams moving through the forest, encounters with giant animals, skirmishes over scrolls, desperate flights through the undergrowth. Garfield watched it all with half his attention, the rest focused on tracking Team 7's progress. They were doing well. Better than well, actually. Naruto's unpredictability, Sasuke's skill, Sakura's growing confidence, they complemented each other in ways that spoke of good teamwork. Kakashi's training was evident in every move they made. And then, on the third day, everything changed. The alarm went off without warning, a shrill klaxon that made everyone in the observation area flinch. On the screens, teams were scattering, fleeing from something in the forest. The camera feeds began to flicker and die, one by one. "What's happening?" someone shouted. Enko was already at the main console, her face pale. "Something just killed the sensor team. All of them. In seconds." Garfield's blood ran cold. He pushed through the crowd, Richard and Raven at his heels. "Which sector?" "Sector 44. Where the Leaf team," Enko's voice cut off as she looked at the tracking board. "Team 7. They're in that sector. So are your kids, Namikaze. All 3 of your teams were converging on that area." Garfield didn't wait to hear more. He was already moving, vaulting over the railing and sprinting toward the forest. Behind him, he heard Richard calling orders to Raven, heard the sounds of other jonin mobilizing. But he didn't slow. "Hold on, Naruto," he thought, his feet pounding against the earth. "Hold on. I'm coming." The forest swallowed him whole, and the screams began. Next. Chapter 3, The Serpent's Tooth. The Forest of Death lived up to its name. Garfield moved through the undergrowth like a blade through silk, his chakra flaring just enough to enhance his speed without leaving a trail any competent sensor couldn't follow. The trees here were ancient, their canopies so dense that the afternoon sun degenerated into a sickly green twilight within seconds of passing the boundary. Vines as thick as his arm hung from every branch, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and wrong. Blood. He'd smelled enough of it in his life to recognize it instantly. Fresh, human, and a lot of it. The screams had stopped, which was worse. Screams meant people were still alive to make noise. Silence meant it was over. A body lay ahead, sprawled across the roots of a massive tree. Garfield slowed, his senses reaching out, but there was no chakra signature. He approached cautiously, already knowing what he'd find. A Chunin, one of the exam proctors, his throat opened with surgical precision. The eyes were still wide with shock, the hands raised in a futile defensive gesture. Whatever had killed him, he'd never seen it coming. Garfield moved on, following the trail of destruction. Broken branches. Scorch marks on the earth. A kunai embedded in a tree trunk, still vibrating faintly from the force of impact. He found another body, a genin from Kusa, this one, her headband cracked, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. She'd been running when something caught her. The sounds of battle reached him then. Not screams this time, but the distinct ring of metal on metal, the crackle of jutsu, the guttural shouts of people fighting for their lives. Garfield poured on speed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into a clearing and stopped dead. The scene before him was chaos given form. In the center of the clearing stood a man, if he could be called that. Tall, pale as a corpse, with long black hair and purple markings around his golden eyes. Those eyes, slit-pupilled like a snake's, swept across the clearing with an expression of cold amusement. His chakra was a tidal wave, a presence so vast and malevolent that Garfield's instinct screamed at him to flee, to put as much distance between himself and this creature as possible. Orochimaru. One of the legendary Sannin. A man whose name was spoken in whispers, if it was spoken at all. And he had Team 7. Sakura was on the ground, pinned by a massive snake that had materialized from nowhere. Sasuke stood before her, his legs shaking, his face a mask of desperate fury. And Naruto was wrapped in the coils of another snake, struggling uselessly, his face purple from lack of air. But they weren't alone. Connor stood between Orochimaru and the leaf genin, his feet planted, his expression one of grim determination. He was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, but he hadn't fallen. Behind him, Roy Harper was circling, an arrow nocked and aimed at Orochimaru's head, his eyes calculating. Stephanie Wayne was at Sakura's side, working frantically at the snake's coils with a chakra blade, her usual composure cracked by urgency. Cameron had created a wall of ice around Terra, who was on her knees, her hands pressed to the earth, her face white with effort. And Blackfire was in the air, her hands blazing with starbolt energy, her face a mask of pure rage. She launched a barrage of emerald fire at Orochimaru, and for a moment, Garfield thought it might actually connect. Orochimaru didn't even look up. A snake erupted from his sleeve, meeting the starbolts mid-flight and absorbing the impact with its body. The creature dissolved into ash, and Orochimaru's golden eyes flickered toward Blackfire with something like interest. Tamaranian, he said, his voice a sibilant whisper that carried across the clearing. How fascinating. I've never dissected one before. Blackfire's response was a shriek of fury and another volley of starbolts, but Garfield was already moving. He crossed the clearing in 3 bounds, his tanto clearing its sheath in a silver arc aimed at Orochimaru's throat. The Sannin moved like smoke. One moment he was there, the next he was 5 feet to the left, his golden eyes fixed on Garfield with renewed interest. Namikaze, Orochimaru breathed, and his tongue, impossibly long, flickered out to taste the air. Minato's little brother. I'd heard you'd crawled off to play in the shadows. And here you are, rushing to the rescue like a proper little hero. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Garfield had ever seen. How touching. Let them go, Garfield said, his voice flat. This doesn't concern them. Oh, but it does. Orochimaru's gaze shifted to Sasuke, and the hunger in those golden eyes made Garfield's blood run cold. The last Uchiha. The Sharingan, ripe for the taking. I've waited a long time for this moment. I won't be denied by a failed experiment from a village that doesn't exist. The snake constricting Naruto tightened its coils, and the boy let out a strangled gasp. Garfield's heart lurched. Connor, he said quietly. Get them out of here. Now. Connor didn't argue. He never did. In one explosive motion, he was at the snake holding Naruto, his hands closing around its throat. The creature's eyes widened, as much as a snake's eyes could, and then Connor pulled. The snake's body tore apart like wet paper, and Naruto tumbled free, gasping and coughing. Roy's arrow flew at the same moment, aimed not at Orochimaru but at the snake holding Sakura. The arrowhead burst on impact, releasing a cloud of smoke and something else, a sedative, Garfield guessed, one of Roy's specialty rounds. The snake's coils loosened, and Stephanie dragged Sakura free. Cameron's ice wall shattered as Terra pushed herself to her feet, her hands glowing with earthen energy. The ground beneath Orochimaru rippled, then erupted upward in a spike of stone that should have impaled him. Orochimaru simply wasn't there. He appeared behind Terra, his hand reaching for her neck, and Garfield knew he wouldn't make it in time. But Raven would. She materialized between Orochimaru and Terra, her hood thrown back, her amethyst eyes blazing with dark energy. A shield of black light flared around them, and Orochimaru's hand bounced off it as if he'd struck solid steel. For the first time, something like surprise flickered across his features. "Interesting," he murmured. "So many interesting children. This visit is proving far more productive than I anticipated." He moved again, faster than sight, and Garfield felt the wind of his passage as he shot past. But Raven was faster still. Her power erupted outward in a wave of pure force, catching Orochimaru mid-flight and hurling him into a tree with enough force to shatter the trunk. The Sannin landed in a crouch, unharmed, his smile wider than ever. "A demon vessel," he said, his voice dripping with delight. "Oh, this is wonderful. Truly wonderful. I must have you for my collection." Raven's face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead. Garfield knew that using her power against someone of Orochimaru's caliber was draining her rapidly. They needed to end this, now. "Everyone fall back," he ordered. "Get to the tower. Now." "But," Naruto started. That wasn't a suggestion. Garfield's voice cracked like a whip. "Move." Connor grabbed Naruto by the collar of his jacket and ran. Roy herded Sakura and Sasuke, the latter still staring at Orochimaru with an expression of terrified fascination. Stephanie and Cameron formed a rearguard, ice and gadgets ready. Terra stumbled after them, supported by Blackfire, who shot one last glare at Orochimaru before following. Raven remained at Garfield's side. "You too," he said quietly. "He'll kill you." "Maybe. But he won't catch the kids. Go. That's an order." Raven held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. She vanished into the trees, her power leaving a faint afterimage in the air. Garfield turned to face Orochimaru alone. The Sannin hadn't moved. He stood in the center of the ruined clearing, his golden eyes fixed on Garfield with an expression of amused curiosity. "Brave," Orochimaru said. "Foolish, but brave. You know you can't stop me. So why stay?" Garfield settled into a fighting stance, his tanto held low. "Because someone has to." Orochimaru laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Minato's brother, buying time with his life. How poetic. I wonder, will you scream as loudly as he did when I kill you?" The mention of his brother sent a spike of rage through Garfield's chest, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached deep into his chakra reserves, feeling the familiar burn of the Namikaze techniques his brother had developed. The Hiraition, the Flying Thunder God technique, was beyond him, he'd never had Minato's talent for sealing arrays. But there were other tricks. Faster tricks. Deadlier tricks. He vanished. Orochimaru's eyes widened slightly as Garfield appeared behind him, tanto aimed for the base of his skull. But the Sannin twisted at the last moment, the blade opening a gash along his shoulder instead of severing his spine. Black blood sprayed, and Orochimaru hissed, actually hissed, in pain and anger. "You'll pay for that," he whispered, and then he was moving, a blur of motion that Garfield could barely track. Their battle lasted perhaps 30 seconds. It felt like hours. Garfield gave everything he had, every technique, every trick, every ounce of speed and strength he possessed. He landed blows that would have killed any normal shinobi. He dodged attacks that should have ended him. He fought like a man possessed, because in a very real sense, he was. But Orochimaru was a Sannin. A legend. A monster who had killed more people than most villages had citizens. In the end, it wasn't a technique that defeated Garfield. It was sheer, overwhelming power. Orochimaru caught him mid-strike, his hand closing around Garfield's throat with impossible strength. He lifted him off the ground, those golden eyes boring into his. "You have your brother's fire," Orochimaru said almost conversationally. "But not his genius. A pity. You could have been something more than a guard dog for children who aren't even yours." Garfield clawed at the hand around his throat, his vision darkening at the edges. He tried to form a hand sign, tried to summon chakra for one final attack, but Orochimaru's grip was cutting off everything. Still, the Sannin continued, "You've delayed me long enough that your little wards might actually escape. I find that annoying." His grip tightened. "Goodbye, Namikaze. Give my regards to your brother." And then something hit Orochimaru like a meteor. The Sannin was torn loose from Garfield, hurled across the clearing and through 3 trees before finally stopping against a massive boulder. Garfield fell to his knees, gasping, his hands going to his throat. Connor stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a fury Garfield had never seen in the boy. His fists were clenched, his entire body trembling with barely controlled power. "I told you to run," Garfield rasped. "Your family," Connor said simply. "Family doesn't run." From the trees, the others emerged. Roy, arrow knocked. Stephanie, gadgets ready. Cameron, ice crystallizing in the air around him. Tara, her hands pressed to the earth, her expression grim. Blackfire, starbolts blazing. And Raven, her eyes pools of shadow, her power coiling around her like living things. They hadn't run. Not one of them. Garfield wanted to yell at them, to order them away, to keep them safe. But looking at their faces, at the determination in their eyes, the willingness to stand against a monster for his sake, he found he couldn't. This was his family. His students. His children, in every way that mattered. And they would fight together. Orochimaru rose from the rubble, his golden eyes sweeping across the assembled shinobi. For the first time, the amusement was gone, replaced by something colder. Something dangerous. "So," he said softly. "The little birds returned to the serpent. How touching. How foolish." His tongue flickered out, tasting the air. "How delicious." He moved. What followed was chaos. Connor met him head-on, trading blows that shattered trees and cratered the earth. Roy's arrows flew in constant streams, forcing Orochimaru to divide his attention. Stephanie's gadgets exploded around him, buying precious seconds. Cameron's ice created barriers and traps, channeling the Sannin's movements. Tara reshaped the very ground beneath his feet, trying to trap him, to trip him, to give the others an opening. Blackfire and Raven provided the heavy firepower. Starbolts and shadow bolts lanced through the air, forcing Orochimaru to dodge and weave in ways that would have killed anyone else. He was faster than them, stronger than them, more experienced than them. But there were 9 of them, and they fought like a single organism, covering each other's weaknesses, exploiting every opening. And Garfield fought at their center, directing the chaos, his Tonto finding every gap in Orochimaru's defenses. He was slower now, his throat bruised and his chakra depleted, but he fought on sheer will alone. For long, terrible minutes, they held their own. But Orochimaru was a Sannin. And Sannin did not lose to children, no matter how talented. He caught Connor with a blow that sent the boy flying into a tree trunk hard enough to leave an impact crater. He dodged Roy's arrows and snapped the bow with a casual flick of his wrist. He shattered Cameron's ice with a gesture and batted aside Stephanie's gadgets like annoying insects. He sidestepped Blackfire's starbolts and Tara's earth spikes with contemptuous ease. And then he was before Sasuke. The Uchiha boy had been hanging back, protecting Sakura and Naruto, who were both still recovering from their earlier ordeals. He saw Orochimaru coming, saw the hunger in those golden eyes, and tried to move. Tried to fight. Tried to do anything. He failed. Orochimaru's hand closed around Sasuke's neck, and the boy went rigid. A seal began to form on his skin, black and writhing, spreading from the Sannin's touch like living darkness. "No!" Sakura screamed, lunging forward. Naruto was right behind her, a Rasengan forming in his hand, a technique Garfield recognized with a shock that nearly stopped his heart. Minato's technique. His brother's legacy, passed to his son. But they were too far away. Too slow. Tara wasn't. She erupted from the ground beneath Orochimaru, her hands glowing with power, her face a mask of desperate determination. She didn't attack him directly, she was smarter than that. Instead, she wrenched the earth itself upward, creating a wall of stone between Orochimaru and Sasuke. The Sannin's hand was torn free, the seal incomplete. He snarled in frustration, his golden eyes fixing on Tara with murderous intent. He moved, faster than before, and this time there was no one close enough to intervene. His hand pressed against Tara's neck. She screamed. The sound was terrible, a high, keening wail of agony that cut through the chaos like a knife. Garfield saw the seal spread across her skin, black and pulsing, saw her eyes roll back in her head, saw her body convulse as Orochimaru's chakra flooded into her. Then Raven was there, her power erupting in a wave of pure darkness that hurled Orochimaru away from Terra. The girl collapsed, unconscious, the cursed mark blazing on her neck like a brand. Terra. Garfield was at her side in an instant, his hands hovering over the mark, afraid to touch it. He could feel the malevolent chakra radiating from it, could see it writhing under her skin like a living thing. Orochimaru rose from where Raven's attack had thrown him. He was bleeding now, actually bleeding, and his expression was one of cold fury. The girl was not my target, he said softly. But she will serve. They all will, in time. His golden eyes swept across the clearing. This is not over. I will have what I came for. The Uchiha. The demon vessel. And now, the little earth user with the interesting friends. He smiled, and it was the most terrible thing Garfield had ever seen. Tell the Hokage that Orochimaru sends his regards. And then he was gone. Just, gone. The pressure of his chakra vanished, leaving the clearing feeling empty and wrong. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sakura burst into tears. Naruto sank to his knees, the Rasengan sputtering out. Sasuke stood frozen, one hand pressed to the mark on his neck, his face pale. Garfield gathered Terra into his arms. She was breathing, thank all the gods, but the cursed mark pulsed with an evil light. He looked up at his team, his family, bleeding and exhausted but alive. We need to move, he said, his voice rough. Now. Before he changes his mind. They moved. The tower rose from the center of the forest like a monument to hope. By the time they reached its base, Terra had regained consciousness, but she was weak, disoriented, and in obvious pain. The cursed mark had spread slightly, tendrils of black reaching toward her shoulder and jaw. Raven supported her, her face pale from chakra exhaustion but her expression determined. The others formed a protective circle, watching the tree lean for any sign of pursuit. The gates of the tower opened as they approached, and Enko Mitarashi stood there, her face ashen. She'd been monitoring the situation, Garfield realized. She knew. Get them inside, she said quietly. Now. The Hokage has been notified. He's on his way. They filed into the tower, leaving the forest of death behind. But Garfield knew, they all knew, that they hadn't left Orochimaru behind. They'd brought a piece of him with them. 2 pieces, actually. In the tower's main hall, a medic was already attending to Sasuke, examining the cursed mark on his neck. The boy sat rigid, his face a mask of controlled terror, while Sakura hovered nearby and Naruto paced like a caged animal. Terra was laid on a cot in the corner, and Raven never left her side. The cursed mark on her neck pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a constant reminder of what Orochimaru had done. Garfield stood apart, watching them all. Richard appeared at his side, his face grave. We need to talk, Richard said quietly. About what happened out there. About what we're going to do now. Garfield nodded, but his eyes were on Terra. On Sasuke. On Naruto, who had finally stopped pacing and was now staring at his hands, the hands that had formed a Rasengan. Minato's Rasengan. There's more, Garfield said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naruto. He used my brother's technique. The Rasengan. Kakashi must have taught him. Richard followed his gaze. That's not all. While you were fighting, I was watching. The boy's chakra, it changed when Orochimaru went after Sasuke. It became something else. Something vast and angry and utterly terrifying. If Orochimaru had pushed harder, I think we might have seen the Kyuubi. The words hung in the air between them. 2 cursed marks. 2 children marked by a monster. And at the center of it all, Naruto, the nephew Garfield had never known existed, the container of the most destructive force in the world, the boy who had just demonstrated his father's signature technique. The 3rd Hokage arrived an hour later, accompanied by a full squad of ANBU. He was an old man, smaller than Garfield remembered, his face lined with decades of leadership and loss. His eyes swept the room, taking in everything, the injured, the exhausted, the terrified, before settling on Garfield. Garfield-kun, he said, his voice gentle. It has been too long. Garfield looked at the man who had lied to him for 15 years. The man who had let his nephew grow up alone and hated. The man who now stood before him wearing the mask of a kindly grandfather. Lord Hokage, Garfield said, and his voice was ice. We need to talk. The old man's eyes flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or guilt, before settling back into their usual warm expression. Yes, he said softly. I believe we do. But as the ANBU moved to secure the room and the medics continued their work, Garfield saw a raven catch his eye from across the hall. She shook her head slightly, a warning. Not now. Not here. The truth would wait. But it would not wait forever. And somewhere in the forest of death, Orochimaru's laughter echoed in the darkness, patient as a serpent, hungry as fire. Next. Chapter 4, Cracks in the Foundation. The tower's upper chambers had been converted into a temporary medical facility. Garfield stood in the doorway of the room where Terra lay, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the muffled sounds of the tower's activity, whispered conversations, hurried footsteps, the occasional sharp command, created a backdrop of controlled chaos. Terra's face was pale against the pillow, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The cursed mark on her neck had darkened overnight, the line spreading like cracked earth across her skin. Even in sleep, she winced, her hands clenching the sheets as if fighting some invisible enemy. Raven sat beside her, one hand hovering over the mark, her eyes closed in concentration. A faint purple glow emanated from her palm, and Garfield could feel the push and pull of her power as she attempted to contain the malevolent chakra. It was exhausting work, he could see it in the tremor of her shoulders, the beads of sweat on her brow, but she hadn't moved from that spot since they'd arrived. How is she? Garfield asked quietly. Raven's eyes opened, and for a moment, he saw something like fear in their amethyst depths. The mark is alive. It's feeding on her chakra, growing stronger. I can slow it, but I can't stop it. Not alone. And Sasuke? Richard appeared at Garfield's elbow, his expression grim. Same situation. The Leaf medics are doing what they can, but they've never dealt with anything like this. One of them mentioned something called a cursed seal, apparently it's one of Orochimaru's specialties. They're trying to find a way to suppress it, but... He trailed off, shaking his head. Garfield's jaw tightened. Two of their kids, marked by a monster, and there was nothing he could do about it. The helplessness was a physical pain, a burning in his chest that demanded action, any action, no matter how reckless. We need to talk to the Hokage, he said. Now. Richard nodded. He's in the main hall. He brought his entire council with him. This isn't going to be a private conversation. I don't care about private. I want answers. The main hall of the tower had been transformed into a command center. Folding tables held maps of the forest, communication equipment, and half-empty cups of tea. ANBU stood at every entrance, their masks hiding whatever emotions they might have felt. And at the center of it all, surrounded by advisors and officials, sat the third Hokage. Hiruzen Sarutobi looked every one of his 68 years in the harsh artificial light. His usual grandfatherly warmth had been replaced by something harder, the face of a man who had led a village through 3 wars and countless crises. When Garfield entered, those aged eyes fixed on him with an intensity that belied their years. Garfield-kun, the Hokage said, gesturing to a chair across from him. Please, sit. We have much to discuss. Garfield didn't sit. He stood before the Hokage, Richard at his side, and let the silence stretch. Around them, the council members shifted uncomfortably. Hamura and Koharu, the Hokage's old advisors, exchanged glances. The elderly Danzo Shimura, present despite his usual preference for shadows, watched with his one visible eye narrowed to a slit. I want to know why, Garfield said finally, his voice low and even, you told me my nephew was dead. The room went still. Even the ANBU seemed to hold their breath. The Hokage's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or guilt. I see you've discovered the truth. I wondered how long it would take. 15 years. Garfield's voice cracked on the words. 15 years I thought my brother's son was dead. 15 years I mourned him. And all that time, he was here. Growing up alone. Hated. Treated like a monster. He took a step forward, and Richard's hand on his arm stopped him from going further. Why? Because it was necessary. The voice came from Danzo, cold and flat as a winter sky. The boy is a weapon. The Kyuubi's container. His identity had to be protected. Protected? Garfield rounded on him, barely restraining the urge to attack. He's not protected. He's an outcast. Children throw rocks at him. Adults cross the street to avoid him. They call him a demon. Is that your idea of protection? Danzo's visible eye showed no emotion. The alternative was worse. If other villages had known the Kyuubi's container was a child, they would have sent assassins. If our own people had known he was the Hokage's son, they would have demanded he be executed or exiled out of fear. Secrecy was the only option. He could have been raised in safety. Trained properly. Loved. Garfield's hands were shaking. He could have had a family. And what family would that have been? The Hokage's voice was gentle, but it cut through the tension like a blade. His parents were dead. You were gone, you'd already left the village, built a new life elsewhere. The clans would have fought over custody, each seeing him as a tool to gain power. The civilians would have rioted. The council. He glanced at Danzo. The council had their own ideas about how the container should be handled. You could have told me. Garfield's voice broke. I was his uncle. I had a right to know. The Hokage was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. Perhaps. Perhaps I should have. But you were young, Garfield. Barely a chunin, consumed by grief and rage. If I had told you the truth, what would you have done? Rushed back to Konoha? Fought the council? Taken the boy and fled? He shook his head slowly. You would have gotten yourself killed, and Naruto would have ended up in Danzo's hands regardless. I made a choice. It was not an easy one, and it was not a kind one. But I made it to protect the village, and to protect the boy. Protect him? Garfield laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Look at him. Really look at him. He's desperate for acknowledgement, for connection, for anyone to see him as something other than a monster. He's lonely, Hokage. Deeply, profoundly lonely. And you call that protection? Loneliness does not kill, Danzo interjected. Assassins do. Riots do. Civil war does. The boy is alive. He is healthy. He has been trained and fed and housed. That is more than many orphans receive. Don't. Richard's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Garfield and Danzo. Don't pretend this was about the boy's welfare. This was about control. About keeping the Kyuubi's power where you could monitor it, manage it, use it if necessary. Naruto was never a person to you. He was a container. A weapon. Just like you said. Danzo's eye narrowed further, but he said nothing. The Hokage raised a hand, silencing the room. This argument serves no purpose. What's done is done. The question now is what we do going forward. He fixed Garfield with a steady gaze. Orochimaru's attack changes everything. He knows about Naruto. He knows about your students. He has marked 2 children with his cursed seals. The exams cannot continue as planned. Cancel them? One of the council members, Hamura, spoke up. The other villages will see it as weakness. Our alliances can be mended, the Hokage interrupted. Dead children cannot. The second exam is already compromised. We have foreign genin injured, foreign jonin questioning our competence and our honesty. His eyes flickered to Garfield. We need to contain the damage. The preliminaries will proceed, but with enhanced security. The final exam will be postponed until we can guarantee the safety of all participants. And Orochimaru? Richard asked. Is being hunted as we speak. Every available ANBU squad is searching the forest. Border patrols have been doubled. If he's still in Fire Country, we will find him. The Hokage's voice hardened. Make no mistake, Orochimaru is my responsibility. He was my student, and his crimes are mine to answer for. I will not allow him to harm anyone else in my village. Garfield wanted to believe him. Wanted to trust that the old man who had once patted his head and called him a promising young shinobi would make things right. But the lie was still there, a wall between them that no amount of regret could tear down. There's something else, he said quietly. Naruto used the Rasengan during the fight. The Hokage's eyes widened slightly. The Rasengan? Minato's technique? Kakashi taught him. Garfield watched the old man's face carefully. He's been training the boy. Protecting him. Watching over him in ways you never did. For the first time, the Hokage looked away. Kakashi has his own reasons for caring for Naruto. He was Minato's student, after all. And he blames himself for what happened that night. For not being there when his sensei died. So he makes up for it by training the son. While you. Garfield shook his head. I don't understand you, Hokage. I don't understand how you could let this happen. You are young, the Hokage said softly. You still believe that leaders can afford to be good. They cannot. They can only afford to be effective. I made choices that haunt me every day. But the village survives. That is my legacy. That is my penance. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsatisfying. Garfield wanted to argue, to scream, to make the old man understand the depth of his betrayal. But what was the point? The past couldn't be changed. All they could do was move forward. Terra and Sasuke, he said instead. The cursed marks. What can be done? The Hokage's expression shifted to one of professional concern. We have our best sealing specialists examining them. The marks are unusual. They seem to enhance the victim's chakra while simultaneously corrupting it. If left unchecked, they will eventually overwrite the victim's personality, replacing it with something more amenable to Orochimaru's purposes. Garfield's blood ran cold. You're saying they'll become his puppets? Eventually, yes. But we have time. The marks need to mature before they can fully take hold. Weeks, perhaps months. In that time, we may be able to develop a counterseal. Something to suppress the mark's influence. The Hokage paused. Your student Raven has been attempting to contain the mark on the girl. Her power is unusual. It may prove useful. She's exhausted herself trying, Richard said. She can't keep it up forever. Then we work quickly. The Hokage stood, signaling that the audience was over. Garfield-kun, I know my words cannot undo the harm I've caused. I know you have every right to hate me. But for the sake of the children, for Naruto, for Terra, for all of them, I ask you to work with us. Orochimaru is a threat to everyone. We must face him together. Garfield stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even trust. It was necessity, and they both knew it. As they left the hall, Richard fell into step beside him. That went better than I expected. He's still lying. Garfield's voice was flat. Not about everything. But about some things. I could see it in his eyes. Probably. Richard shrugged. Leaders always lie. It's part of the job description. The question is whether his lies are aimed at helping us or using us. I don't know yet. Garfield stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking up toward the rooms where his students waited. But I'm going to find out. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Medics came and went, examining Terra and Sasuke, taking readings, trying different seals and techniques to suppress the cursed marks. Nothing worked for long. The marks seemed to adapt, shifting and changing to circumvent each new barrier. Raven refused to leave Terra's side. She slept in fits and starts, her power always partially extended, always pushing back against the mark's influence. The exhaustion was taking its toll, her face had grown pale, her eyes shadowed, but she wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop, she said. If she did, the mark would advance too far to contain. Garfield spent his time moving between his students, checking on each of them, making sure they were coping. Connor had mostly healed from his injuries, his Kryptonian heritage speeding his recovery. Roy had already fashioned a new bow from materials scavenged from the tower's supplies. Stephanie ran constant diagnostics on her gadgets, ensuring everything was functional. Cameron meditated in a corner of the common room, ice crystals forming and melting in a slow, rhythmic cycle around him. Blackfire paced like a caged animal, her frustration at being cooped up palpable. Starfire tried to cheer everyone up with stories of Tamarin, her bright optimism a strange counterpoint to the tension. And Naruto. Naruto kept finding excuses to be near them. At first, Garfield thought it was coincidence. The boy seemed to be everywhere, in the common room when they gathered for meals, in the hallway when Garfield walked to Terra's room, on the training ground when Connor practiced his forms. But after the third such coincidence, Garfield realized the truth. Naruto was curious about them. About him. They finally spoke on the evening of the second day. Garfield had stepped onto a small balcony off the main hall, seeking a moment of quiet, when he heard footsteps behind him. Excuse me? He turned. Naruto stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of nervousness and determination that was so painfully familiar Garfield's heart ached. Can I help you? Garfield asked, keeping his voice neutral. Naruto shuffled his feet. I wanted to thank you. For what you did in the forest. You and your team. You saved us. The words came out in a rush. Sakura-chan and Sasuke team and me. If you hadn't shown up, that snake guy would have. He trailed off, swallowing hard. You're welcome. Garfield studied him, seeing Minato in every line of his face, Kushina in the stubborn set of his jaw. But you don't need to thank me. Protecting others is what shinobi do. Naruto nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly working up to something. Is it true? He finally burst out. That your name is Namikaze? Like the fourth Hokage? Garfield's throat tightened. Yes. The fourth Hokage was my brother. Naruto's eyes went wide. Your brother? So that means you're my... He stopped, confusion replacing excitement. Wait, but the old man said my parents were dead. That I don't have any family. The words were like a knife. Garfield forced himself to breathe, to think, to choose his next words carefully. The Hokage told you that? Yeah. When I was little. He said my parents died in the Kyuubi attack, and that I didn't have any relatives. Naruto's brow furrowed. But if the fourth was your brother, and he was my dad, he stopped again, his face going pale. Wait. Is the fourth my dad? Is that what you're saying? Garfield stared at him. The boy didn't know. After all these years, after everything, no one had told him who his father was. Naruto. He didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone that the parent they've never known was a hero, a legend, the most beloved Hokage in living memory? How do you explain that the village that despises him is the same village his father died to protect? Before he could find the words, a voice interrupted them. Naruto. There you are. Sakura appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. Sasuke's awake and asking for you. Well, not asking, exactly. He said, tell the dobe to get in here, which is practically a warm welcome from him. Naruto's face shifted instantly, the confusion replaced by concern. Sasuke team's awake? Is he okay? Mostly. The medics say the mark isn't getting worse, at least. Sakura glanced at Garfield, her expression wary. Sorry to interrupt. It's fine. Garfield stepped back, giving Naruto an out. Go. Your teammate needs you. Naruto hesitated, his blue eyes, Minato's eyes, Kushina's eyes, searching Garfield's face for something. Then he nodded and followed Sakura inside. Garfield stood on the balcony for a long time after they left, staring at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Orochimaru was waiting. Somewhere out there, answers lurked in shadows. And in a room upstairs, his nephew, his brother's son, was beginning to ask questions that would shatter everything he thought he knew. The cracks were spreading. And Garfield had a terrible feeling that when they finally broke, nothing would ever be the same. The preliminaries were announced the next morning. All remaining genin were summoned to the tower's main hall, where the Hokage himself stood before them, flanked by Anbu and Jonin from every participating village. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the memory of Orochimaru's attack and the knowledge that 2 of their number bore his mark. The second exam is officially concluded, the Hokage announced, his voice carrying through the hall. Due to the events in the forest, we have determined that continuing in the usual format would be unsafe. Therefore, we will proceed directly to the preliminary rounds. Murmurs rippled through the assembled genin. Naruto looked confused. Sakura looked nervous. Sasuke stood rigid, the cursed mark visible at the edge of his collar, his expression unreadable. The preliminaries will be one-on-one combat matches, the Hokage continued. Winners advance to the final exam, which will be held in 1 month's time. Losers are eliminated. Matches will be held in a secure location with multiple Jonin observers. Any attempt to kill an opponent will result in immediate disqualification and further consequences. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I understand that many of you are tired, injured, or grieving. But the Chunin exams do not stop for tragedy. They test your ability to function under the worst possible conditions. Today, those conditions are real. Garfield watched from the observation area as the genin absorbed this news. His own students stood clustered together, their expressions ranging from Connor's calm acceptance to Blackfire's barely contained eagerness. Terra was there, supported by Raven, the cursed mark visible on her neck. She should not be fighting. She could barely stand. But she had insisted on participating, and neither Garfield nor Richard had been able to change her mind. She's going to get herself killed, Richard murmured at his side. She's going to try. Garfield's voice was heavy. But I don't think she'll get the chance. Look at her. She can barely focus her chakra. As if hearing him, Terra's gaze lifted to meet his. There was something in her eyes, determination, yes, but also fear. She knew she wasn't ready. But she also knew that backing down now would mean accepting Orochimaru's mark as a defeat. And Terra had never accepted defeat easily. The matches were drawn by lot, names called one by one. Garfield watched as his students were assigned opponents, some familiar, some unknown. Connor drew a large boy from Kumo who looked like he ate boulders for breakfast. Roy got a swift-looking kunoichi from Suna. Stephanie faced a Hyuga, which would be an interesting test of her gadgets against the gentle fist. Cameron drew a genin from Kusa with a nervous smile and trembling hands. And then Terra's name was called. Her opponent was a boy from Oto, one of Orochimaru's village, Garfield realized with a chill. Tall, pale, with empty eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He looked at Terra the way a cat looks at a mouse. The match began, and Garfield's fears were realized immediately. Terra's control was shot. The cursed mark flared whenever she tried to use her earth techniques, throwing off her aim, weakening her constructs. She managed to raise a wall, but it crumbled almost instantly. She tried to sink her opponent into the ground, but the earth wouldn't respond. The Oto boy moved like a snake, fast, fluid, deadly. He was toying with her, dodging her attacks, landing blows that weren't quite hard enough to end the match. Prolonging her suffering. Enjoying it. On the observation level, Garfield's hands gripped the railing hard enough to leave dents. Beside him, Raven's power flickered, responding to her emotions. She's going to lose, Richard said quietly. We need to be ready to catch her if. The Oto boy's fist connected with Terra's jaw, and she went down. The proctor, a scarred jonin named Gozu, raised his hand to declare the match over. And then Terra moved. It wasn't her. Garfield knew it instantly, the same way he knew the sun would rise. The cursed mark blazed with purple light, and Terra's eyes, when she opened them, were golden. Snake eyes. She rose from the ground in a single fluid motion, her body no longer her own. The earth around her trembled, then erupted. Spikes of stone shot upward, forcing the Oto boy to dodge. The ground cracked and split, opening chasms that hadn't been there a moment before. And Terra, or whatever was controlling her, smiled with Orochimaru's smile. Stop the match, Garfield shouted. Stop it now. But before anyone could move, Terra's power lashed out. A wave of stone slammed into the Oto boy, hurling him across the arena. He hit the wall with a sickening crunch and didn't get up. The proctor was already moving, but Raven was faster. She appeared before Terra, her hands raised, her eyes blazing with dark light. Terra! Fight it! This isn't you. For a moment, the golden eyes flickered. Terra's face contorted with effort, her own will battling against the mark's influence. Then the gold receded, and she collapsed. Raven caught her before she hit the ground. In the observation area, Garfield turned to find the Hokage watching with an expression of grim understanding. Behind him, Danzo's visible eye gleamed with something that might have been interest. The mark is more advanced than we thought, the Hokage said quietly. It's already trying to assert control. Can you stop it? Garfield demanded. We'll try. The Hokage's voice was heavy. But Garfield-kun, you need to prepare yourself. The seal may not be reversible. And if it isn't. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Below, Raven carried Terra from the arena, her face a mask of desperate determination. The other matches continued, Connor demolishing his opponent with casual ease, Roy winning through superior tactics, Stephanie outsmarting the Hyuga with gadgets he'd never seen, Cameron freezing his opponent solid in a display of casual power, but Garfield barely saw them. His attention was on Terra. On the mark that was slowly stealing her from them. On the monster who had put it there. And on the boy in the crowd, Naruto, his nephew, watching with wide eyes and a trembling hands, who had no idea that the same monster was hunting him too. The preliminaries continued, but the cracks were spreading. And Garfield knew, with the certainty of a shinobi who had survived too much to believe in easy answers, that the worst was yet to come.